Hello friends, and welcome back to my channel. I am in fact indoors, so I don't need to be wearing a mask. Side note, wearing masks with glasses has really been quite the experience. For today's video, I decided to do a pandemic book reviews because we are in the middle of pandemics, and I have coincidentally read 2 books this year that had to do with some sort of pandemic. One of them man-made and the other one actually real. So let's get into it. So the first book that I'm going to talk about is a classic, The Stand by Stephen King. So most people probably heard of this book, and if you are a Stephen King fan, then you probably read this book. It's a book that has been touted as one of his greatest works, and I have to agree, it's perhaps my favorite book of all the Stephen King books that I have read. Mind you, I haven't read them all, but I've read a decent number, and The Stand remains at my #1 spot. So I read this book in January of this year, before our own coronavirus thing became the huge deal that it is here in the US. So the premise of this book is that there was this super flu strain that was created in a US lab, and somehow it escaped and spread to the rest of the country and eventually the whole world, and it killed most people. So we are now in this desolate world where only a few survivors are left, and they have the challenge of rebuilding society. So in the book, they call this super flu Captain Trips, and the first part of the book describes how the flu spread, and I thought that was probably one of my favorite parts because he goes into extreme detail of how we begin from the lab and slowly we see it spreading all over the country as we're being introduced to all of the characters in the book, and that was really well done on his part. A few things to know about this book: it was written, or it was released in 1978, and if you've read any older Stephen King novels, you know that the language that he uses in those books aren't things that would probably be okay in today's world. So if you're planning to read that book, be aware of that. This book is extremely character driven. There is a lot of time spent on character development, and I found that in the reviews for this book, people seem to either really like that or they really didn't like it because they felt like it slowed down the pace of the book too much. I loved it. I loved the development of the characters in this book. There are so many characters, I'm not going to be able to get into all of them, but I'll list some of my favorite ones. So the main theme in this book is this good versus evil dynamic. After most people have died off, we're left with these 2 groups. One of them are the good and one of them are the evil, and they each have a leader. So the good are led by Mother Abigail, and then the evil people are led by Randall Flagg. Mother Abigail was one of my favorite characters in this book. And side note, I don't know if anyone else has noticed this, but Stephen King seems to always include some like wise black character in his books. Like I've noticed this in almost every single Stephen King book that I have read. Usually they're male, but this time Mother Abigail was a 108-year-old black woman sitting on a porch in Nebraska. So she invaded the dreams of a lot of the survivors. And then of course we have Randall Flagg, and he's the leader of the evil guys. Randall Flagg has these supernatural powers, and he rules over his people with an iron fist. Total authoritarian regime over there. And then you kind of see the pros and cons of both, because his people, while they're living in fear, they are far more organized than the good people who are a little bit more democratic. Of course, there are many more characters that I can't get into. Probably my favorite characters were Nick Andrews and Tom Cullen. I love Tom Cullen, and I listened to this book while reading it, and I did a video on why I do this, but the narrator of the audiobook did such a good job playing Tom Cullen and just made that character even more lovable. The ending of this book was actually not my favorite. I'm not going to get into the details in case you are looking to read this book, but I felt like it was almost rushed because we spent so much time getting to know these characters and setting up the storyline. I felt like the ending was just way too quick and way too sudden and not as well thought out as the rest of the book. Overall, I give this book 5 out of 5 stars. It is probably my most favorite book that I have read so far this year. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and while I don't usually reread books, if I were to, this would be one of them because it was so enjoyable. And I wouldn't fear ruining the end because I didn't particularly like the end anyway. I just loved the characters. So getting to reread those characters would be something something that I'd be willing to do. The second book that I read that was on a pandemic this year was The Murmur of Bees. So I read this book simply because it was on Kindle Unlimited, and I was able to get the ebook and the audiobook together, which is something that I mentioned again in my video on how to read faster. So this book was set in Mexico during the 1918 Spanish flu pandemic, which is another flu pandemic that we're hearing about a lot more now in reference to our current coronavirus pandemic. And this book, for the most part, follows a family that a little boy has become a part of. So he was found abandoned, and he had this cleft deformity that they called the devil's kiss. And he was also surrounded by a swarm of bees. And that's where the title of the book comes from, The Murmur of Bees. This little boy's name was Simón Pío. And it turns out he actually had these psychic abilities where he was able to know things that other people had no way of knowing. He never got lost, and he became a strong protective force for the Morales family who had adopted him. Why did I love this book? Because I did love this book. I think it was just so beautifully written, and I couldn't believe that when I went to do more research after reading it, this book was actually translated from Spanish, but it was just done so well, and there were so many metaphors that were used throughout the book that it's hard to believe that they had been translated because they were so effective in what they were meant to do. This book was outside of what I usually read. I don't usually read historical fiction, but again, I just saw it on Kindle Unlimited and I saw that it had high ratings, so I decided to try it out, and I'm so glad that I did. I would give this book 5 out of 5 stars, and I would highly recommend it. It was long, so I was very, very happy that I had the audiobook companion while I was reading this book. And again, it's part of Kindle Unlimited, so feel free to check it out if you are interested. All right, so that wraps up my pandemic book review. So The Stand and The Murmur of Bees. I enjoyed both of these books for very different reasons. One of them was just this very heavily character-driven novel, and the other one was this historical fiction literary narrative. So I feel like they both serve different audiences. They just both happen to cater. They both just so happen to feature these flu pandemic, and I just happened to read both of them in the year 2020 before our own pandemic blew up. If you've read any of those books, then let me know what you thought of them. If you're planning to read these books now, also let me know that below. And if you like this video, then go ahead and like the video, and feel free to subscribe to this channel, and I will see you in another video. Thank you.